They told me not to touch her, that she was unstable, alien, a threat we couldn't classify. But when my fingers grazed her skin, I didn't feel danger, I saw a memory. Not mine, hers. It hit me like shattered light, ancient and aching. She wasn't a specimen, she was a story, one no one dared to hear, until I did. They told me not to touch her. Which, given my specialty and the fact that I was supposed to help save her life, made for one hell of a logistical problem. The first thing you learn in exobiological trauma care is that touch is everything. Not just for scans and diagnostics and injections, but because touch is how you make them feel real. How you comatose without translation. How you convince something with 3 lungs and no concept of mammalian warmth that you're here to help. But this one was different. Her file had a word stamped in red 3 times on the first page, bioresonant. That meant don't touch, don't scan without clearance, and for the love of all bureaucratic sanity, do not let your skin come into contact with hers. Naturally, I touched her within 20 minutes of arrival. Not intentionally. I'm not that reckless. I had just landed on Earth station, orbiting a dead moon around a half-dead gas giant, which made the whole place feel like a cosmic hospice center. I wasn't here for vacation. I'd been summoned by a level theta anomaly code, which meant some poor creature was dying in a way nobody else could fix, and someone thought I could. The nurse drone that greeted me had 1 broken leg and a kind of voice modulation that sounded like a guilt-ridden cello. It led me past auto-sterile chambers, decontamination fields, and at least 3 layers of bureaucratic hesitation before we got to her. Room 43. No windows. Low light. Temperature held steady at 16 degrees Celsius, which is fine if you're a bioform that prefers cold-blooded stasis. Not ideal for humans, but no one asked me. She was laid out on a med slab that looked more like an altar than a piece of clinical equipment. Her skin was the first thing I noticed. It was not quite silver, not quite violet, but something in between, a shifting hue like oil on water under starlight. It pulsed faintly, not in rhythm with any heartbeat, but with something deeper, slower, like the memory of a breath taken long ago. Her face was still. No oxygen tubes. No feeding lines. The data monitor showed stable vitals, which only made things more confusing because she looked gone. Not dead, but not here either. The chart called her Ilari, which I'd heard of in Xenobio texts but never encountered in person. Supposed to be a near-extinct species, lived in isolation, claimed their bodies carried the genetic memories of all their ancestors. Most dismissed it as myth. Some believed it. I had no opinion. Until she reached for me. It wasn't dramatic. One of her fingers twitched when I leaned closer to scan her cranial cortex. I leaned in because the scalp node was oddly placed, and I was curious about the scar near her temple. It looked healed but ancient, like it had been earned over several lifetimes. As I adjusted the scanner, my gloved hand slipped on the console edge and brushed her wrist. Just a graze. Skin to skin. And then I saw it. I wasn't in the room anymore. I wasn't on Earth station. I was in a field of glass flowers under twin suns, watching a child with glowing hair chase something that looked like a floating ribbon through a meadow of colors I don't have names for. The air smelled like memory, and my lungs burned from the purity of it. I heard laughter that echoed with harmonic undertones, like multiple generations laughing through a single voice. Then fire. Screams. A sky turning red. And a child running, not for joy, but for survival. I pulled my hand back like I touched a live wire. I staggered into the console behind me, heart pounding, breath ragged. She didn't move. But I knew what had happened. I had seen her memory. Not a hologram. Not a playback. A living, breathing, multi-sensory chunk of history slammed into my nervous system through a half-second of contact. I had to sit down. The nurse drone asked if I required sedatives. I told it no, then asked if she had been touched by anyone else. The drone responded that contact protocols had been strictly followed. Her skin emits no known toxins, No biological contagions, nothing except. The second time I touched her, I made the mistake of trying to control it. The first time had been a stumble into someone else's past, like tripping over a hidden step in a cathedral you never meant to enter. But this time, I went in with intention, gloves off, mind clear, protocols be damned, and as a result, the memory hit harder, deeper, more brutal, like it knew I wasn't just visiting but attempting to take something. And maybe it wanted to take something back. I touched the side of her neck, just under the jawline where the dermal surface looked calmer, less reactive, and instantly, I was no longer in a lab, or on a station, or even in a body I recognized. I was flying. Not with wings, not with tech, just moving fast and soundless through the clouds of a massive world covered in electric trees and floating landmasses that obeyed no laws of gravity. There was no wind, no engine hum, just momentum guided by thought. Below me, a city pulsed like a living circuit board, temples of memory built in perfect fractal spirals. People glowed from within, all moving in harmony, all connected by strands of light that traveled across their skin like migrating stars. I wasn't me. I was her. I felt it, her muscles, her breath, her thoughts. Not observing but inhabiting. She was young, curious, unafraid, the way only someone ancient and reborn too many times could be. Then something in the sky cracked. A red scar tore through the clouds. Panic surged, not just in me but in the collective beneath. The strands of light darkened. The floating temples began to fall. A sound like a scream without source or end shook the air, and then I was pulled out. Hard. Gasping. Back in the lab. The biosensors on my wrist flashing red. Cortisol through the roof. My blood pressure matched that of a man being strangled by memory. I vomited into the waste bin without grace or warning and leaned against the med table while her skin glowed faintly, like it had fed on me. Maybe it had. The assistant drone hovered uncertainly nearby, its logic processor clicking audibly, as if it had just witnessed something that broke protocol and couldn't quite decide whether to report it or quietly pretend it never happened. I waved it off. I needed to think. What I saw, what I felt, was not just a memory. It was a download. I had felt her body, her heartbeat, her fear, which meant her dermal resonance wasn't just playback. It was experiential transfer. She wasn't showing me a movie. She was inserting a ghost of herself into my neurology. That changed everything. I ran the analysis on the glove I'd worn earlier. The inside was lined with nanofiber designed to neutralize electrical signals, but not designed for anything like what she emitted. There was a residue left behind. Not chemical. Quantum. Particle entanglement at microdecoherence levels. In other words, her skin didn't just remember, it linked. The more I touched her, the more those links became persistent. I didn't even have to touch her again to feel echoes after that. I walked past the door to her chamber and I saw flashes. A tree made of crystal. A woman cradling a glowing orb. A funeral where no one cried, because everyone became the dead for one shared moment before release. I started dreaming in her symbols. Triangles that folded into fifth-dimensional space. Voices without mouths singing in chords only heard in bone. And every time I dreamed, I woke up more certain that she was still alive in there, not just biologically but consciously. She was listening. Maybe even choosing what to send. I decided to test that theory. I set up a simple cortical feedback loop using a modified empathy sync device, normally used for therapy in PTSD patients. The station's director didn't need to know. I coded it under a stress calibration study and rerouted the permissions through my own IDK. It was stupid, reckless, unethical, and entirely necessary. The sync device would allow me to ask. Not with words, but with emotion. A specific emotional pattern could be encoded and transmitted through directed neurological PU. By the time I touched her for the 8th time, I had stopped thinking like a doctor and started thinking like a translator, which is a dangerous shift for someone whose entire medical certification is built around observation, interpretation, and the holy trinity of biochemical neutrality. But there I was, night after night, sitting beside a being who had never spoken a word to me, yet communicated more clearly than most of my human colleagues with their perfect syntax and endless spreadsheets of diagnostic algorithms. I was not proud of this shift in focus. I knew the risks: empathy fatigue, memory contamination, identity slippage, all the things they warn you about when you take advanced xenoneurology training. But none of those warnings accounted for her skin. Not metaphorically, her actual skin, which at this point I had begun to study as if it were a living text, not flesh but a palimpsest, layer upon layer of history, pain, ritual, loss, victory, all encoded not in DNA or neural fibers but in something more elusive, something that behaved like memory but transmitted like language. I built a scanner to test it, which sounds more impressive than it was. In reality, it was a reconfigured synaptic amplifier stolen from an old trauma kit and jury-rigged to a resonance monitor originally designed to measure sleep cycles. I called it the pulse lens because that made it sound official enough to get past the station's increasingly curious administration. The lens worked by magnifying bioemissions just above the dermal layer, amplifying whatever it was she was projecting whenever I touched her, and displaying it as light trails across a screen. Messy, unreadable chaos at first, but the more data I collected, the more patterns emerged. Not images, but waveforms, rhythms, and pulses that repeated in strange intervals, not unlike spoken syllables or primitive song structures. I ran the waveforms through a linguistic analysis program, and after 2 weeks of nothing but noise, it spat out something interesting. Not language in the traditional sense, but repetition sequences with structure similar to proto-language, like whale song or the tonal math of early Terran tribes, which made me stare at the readout for a long time because it meant that whatever she was doing with her skin, it wasn't just memory broadcasting, it was communication, intentional and recursive, which raised the question I had been trying to avoid. What if she wasn't just bleeding memory into me? What if she was waiting for me to answer? That idea made my stomach twist, not with fear but with awe, because it meant this was a conversation, and I had been monologuing like a jackass. I recalibrated the lens to run in reverse, allowing it to send simplified pulse sequences back into her dermal field. Low frequency, low amplitude, nothing that would cause harm, just enough to test the theory. I tapped a simple signal, 3 tones spaced evenly, then repeated it a few seconds later, then again. I waited. 30 seconds passed. Nothing. I turned off the lens and reached for her hand, which had become an absurd ritual of mine, like an addict pretending he wasn't addicted. I whispered, "Hey, it's Elias," just in case she was listening, which at this point I was increasingly convinced she was. And then it happened. Her skin responded. Not visibly, not like a color change or shiver, but the lens picked up a mirror signal, a perfect echo of the tones I had just sent. Not delayed, not distorted. She had heard me, and replied. I may have shouted something embarrassing. I don't remember. I just know that I ran out of the room and then back in again, because I needed to confirm it wasn't hallucination or wishful thinking. I repeated the signal, changed the intervals. She answered again. Adjusted again. Another response. Each time slightly modified, which meant not only was she hearing me, but she was adapting her responses to match my changes. It was a conversation, a real one, conducted entirely through waveform pulses across memory-encoded skin. The science was beautiful. The first time I saw myself in one of her memories, I thought I had finally gone insane. Not metaphorically. Not creatively. But clinically. The kind of madness that wraps itself around you like a warm coat, because at that moment it made more sense than reality. I had been experimenting with deeper resonance pulses, a sort of call and response system that allowed me to send more complex constructs, emotion, and image together, like telling a story with light instead of language. I sent her the memory of my mother's laugh, filtered through my own nostalgia, wrapped in the scent of warm cotton and old books, the things that made me feel safe when I was 8 years old. She responded with something unexpected, a sharp flash of dissonance followed by a place I had never seen before, a platform high above a sea of shifting colors, a gathering of beings taller than humans, robed in soft metallic fabric, standing in rows, their eyes glowing with quiet understanding. And there at the center of the image was me, or someone who looked like me. Not a perfect likeness, but close enough that my brain could not separate the difference. He wore the same expression I had when I talked to her, calm but uncertain, reverent but questioning. He was kneeling in front of her. She was standing, radiant, ageless, her skin pulsing gently. He reached up and touched her face exactly the way I had done the first night I whispered her name. I did not breathe for a full minute afterward. And when I finally did, the air felt heavier, like the gravity in the room had changed. The scanner confirmed I had not hallucinated. The memory burst had been external, projected from her, not pulled from my own mind, which meant that somewhere in the depths of her memory there existed someone like me, or I had somehow been inserted into that history. And the worst part was I could not tell which was more terrifying. I ran diagnostics on myself, every scan I could get without raising suspicion, neurological, thermal resonance, cognitive drift, pattern mapping. They all confirmed what I feared. My brain was beginning to change. Not damaged. Not failing. But adapting. New neural pathways forming in response to her memory structures, shortcuts, and bridges appearing that bypassed normal thought flow, like I was becoming optimized for her language. And not just to understand it, but to live it. I started writing in symbols I could not explain, sketching tactile waveforms in the margins of my notes, symbols that matched her resonance logs. When I tried to remember the sequence that led to them, I could not. It was like remembering a dream I had not yet had. I stopped reporting to the director. I stopped sleeping in my assigned quarters. I stopped pretending that this was just a study, or a mission, or a curiosity. Somewhere deep inside I had accepted the truth. I was no longer just a man studying a forgotten species. I was becoming a carrier of her history, a witness not just to the past but to a lineage of connection, a ritual of remembrance that transcended biology and bled into time itself. And maybe that was what she needed all along. Someone not to save her. Not to analyze her. Not to repair her. But to remember her. To be the next chapter in a story that had been told skin to skin across centuries and lost worlds. The hallucinations started shortly after that, soft at first, fleeting flashes in the corners of my vision, the smell of ozone in sterile rooms, the sound of her voice, not in words but in pulses that vibrated in my teeth. Then they became stronger. I would wake up in places I had not gone, or think I had spoken aloud when I had not. And the dreams got worse, or better, depending on how you define falling asleep and living entire lifetimes as a star walker on glass deserts with her by my side. Better for meaning. Worse for sanity. In one dream we were fugitives. In another we were teachers. In one we were just quiet, curled beneath a sky of endless auroras, breathing the same air and knowing that memory was enough. I started talking to her out loud. Not do. I never noticed the scar until she showed it to me, which sounds ridiculous considering I had been staring at her face almost daily for weeks, but that is how it works with memory, language, and resonance. You do not see until you are meant to, or maybe until she wants you to, because the scar under her eye was not physical in the way we understand it. It was dermal, yes, a faint indentation like a crescent moon faded beneath the surface, but it was also more than that. It was a locus, a memory anchor, an encoded trauma sealed into the skin not as a wound but as a signature, and when I finally saw it for what it was, I realized it was the beginning of the story she had not wanted to tell me before, not because she could not, but because I had not yet earned it. I was sitting beside her late again, sleep-deprived, cortex buzzing from residual echoes of the last contact when I noticed the pulse pattern on her cheek had changed. It was slower, less rhythmic, more fragmented, and when I touched her hand gently just once, the image came through so fast I did not have time to brace myself. I was inside her again, but this time everything felt brittle, the colors were muted, the air sharp with static. I was standing, or she was standing in front of a tribunal, not metaphorical, not symbolic, an actual high platform. 3 judges cloaked in gleaming robes of metallic green, faces masked, their voices vibrating the walls. They were speaking a sentence, and she was not arguing, she was not begging, she was silent. Her skin glowed dimly but not in fear, in defiance. She was being exiled, not for what she had done but for what she refused to do, and what she refused was to forget. They wanted her to erase a portion of the memory lattice, to conform to the new narrative, to comply with the decision of collective memory curators who believed some truths were too dangerous to carry forward, especially truths that revealed internal betrayal during their final war. But she refused. She had encoded it into her skin, a record of a failed alliance, a decision that led to the loss of an entire colony, her colony, and she had watched them die, every one of them. They told her that carrying such memory was a threat to unity, a contamination, a weapon, and she replied by standing still, by letting her scar form beneath her eye as the memory solidified, by choice, not by accident, not by injury. It was her mark, her refusal to lie in silence, and for that she was cast out from the memory web, her connection severed, her voice no longer part of the collective song. I felt her heart break as if it were my own. I felt the scream she did not give. I felt the way her hands shook when they injected the isolator protein into her spine, severing her from the chain of remembering, and how even then she whispered the names of the dead, not for pity, not for resistance, but for truth, because if she did not remember them, then they would never have lived at all. When I came back to myself, my face was wet, I had cried without noticing. I sat there for hours, unable to speak, unable to touch her again, because I knew now what that scar meant. It was not just a wound, it was a promise, a line in the skin that said I will not forget even if it costs me everything. The next day I began to treat the scar as a terminal node, a place where encoded memory could be extracted with finer precision. I calibrated the pulse lens to micro-resonance level and slowly, gently began mapping the lattice around the mark. It was unlike any other region of her skin, not just in density but in emotional weight. The sequences were slower, heavier, layered with concepts that had no earth language equivalent, grief that lingered without bitterness, rage without heat, love that persisted in the face of annihilation. And beneath all of it, a question, not spoken, not encoded, but humming constantly. Why me? Why was I the one left behind? Why did I survive? And that broke me, because I had asked the same thing once when my sister died in the accident and I walked away with barely a SCR. I did not expect her to speak, not in a traditional sense, not in any way I had known before, because speaking to her had always meant resonance and memory and the language of pulses and skin. But then one night while the station slept under its usual hum of half-functioning systems and the pulse lens lay cold and dormant on my desk and I was simply watching her the way I often did when the day had run out of answers, she whispered my name. It was not loud and it was not clear and it was not even vocal in the way the human throat produces sound, but I felt it and I heard it, not with ears but with something deeper, some internal structure of perception that had quietly grown inside me over the past weeks. A new organ of attention tuned not to sound waves but to presence, and there it was, Elias, 3 syllables not quite matching the cadence of my language but unmistakable in meaning, and it stopped me completely. Every thought froze, every muscle halted, like the entire world paused to make space for the moment, and for a few precious seconds I was not a doctor or a man or a memory translator, I was simply the one she chose to speak to, and that truth burned so brightly in my chest that I forgot to breathe. The whisper was not a word alone, it carried emotion layered within it like a cord made of feeling, the sadness of distance, the surprise of recognition, and the tiniest fragile shimmer of hope, and I said yes, though I was not sure what I was agreeing to, and then I reached for her hand, without the pulse lens, without gloves, without thought, because this was no longer a procedure, it was a moment between 2 beings who no longer cared what species or language or universe separated them. When I touched her again, she opened everything, not just a memory, not just a story, but an unfiltered transmission of self, and I saw her not through history but through her eyes, in a moment when she had stood on the last mountain of a dying world, watching ships leave the sky like stars falling in reverse and knowing she would not be on any of them, because someone had to stay behind, Someone had to remember the ground, the roots, the place where her people had sung their first songs, and I saw her kneel in the ash and press her hands into the dirt and whisper names, not for anyone else but for herself, for the wind, for the silence. Then I saw her in exile, drifting through ruins, sleeping under skies with no constellations she recognized, marking time not by calendars but by the decay of memories inside her body, and all the while whispering Elias, not as a name but as a concept, a hope that one day someone would come who would see her as she was and not as a relic or threat or carrier of dangerous truth, and somehow, impossibly, that name was mine. I knew then that she had not chosen me by accident, she had called to me across time or fate or resonance and I had answered without knowing, and now the circuit was closed. I felt every moment she had carried in her bones, every face, every death, every time she had touched someone who later forgot her, and how that forgetting hurt worse than any wound, because when you remember everything, the cruelest thing the universe can do is surround you with people who remember nothing. And yet she endured, and yet she waited, and yet she whispered, and now I was here, and I whispered back, I am with you, and the air in the room changed. The temperature shifted, not scientifically, not measurably, but emotionally, and I saw her fingers twitch, not with reflex but with will, and her lips moved again, Elias, softer this time, as if testing the weight of the name. Then she opened her eyes for the first time. They were not what I expected, not alien, not human, not ancient or wise or tragic, they were clear and searching and painfully alive, like someone waking from centuries of drowning and finding air hurts more than water. We stared at each other, and neither of us knew what to say, because everything that could be said had already been felt, and then, without thinking, I laughed, not low. The first time I tried to map her full memory lattice, I thought it would be like assembling a puzzle, something complicated sure, maybe layered, maybe non-linear, but still a thing with edges, a thing that could be completed eventually with time, patience, and enough neural processing power, and I was wrong, because it was not a puzzle, it was a galaxy, and I was a flashlight taped to a rock trying to chart the stars and failing beautifully. She was not just a person with a long life, or even a species with intergenerational memory, she was a continuum, a living sequence of lived history nested within itself like a recursive echo chamber where every thought informed another and each choice rippled both forward and backward in time, and when I touched her that night with her eyes open and her skin warmer than ever, I fell into it completely with no resistance, because for once she was not pushing fragments or glimpses, she was offering the whole thing, or at least what my brain could hold. I learned that I had underestimated her by entire orders of magnitude. I saw her first memory, and by first I do not mean childhood, I mean the beginning, the literal biological dawn of her people, recorded in a living thread of dermal resonance that passed from ancestor to offspring not by genetics but by selection. She remembered being born inside a field of blue sand where the sky shimmered with sound and her mother was not a mother but a collective of memories shaped into form who whispered into her bones until she remembered them too, and I watched her grow through centuries of wonder, walking across planets that no longer exist, whose names no longer translate into any known language, building bridges made of light, teaching others how to fold gravity into song, and still she was not alone, always part of the memory, always part of the whole, until the schism, the break, the choice to become singular. She was the first to say no, the first to hold an identity separate from the resonance web, and for that she was revered and feared in equal measure. I saw her become a leader not by vote, not by conquest, but because no one else remembered as clearly as she did, and that clarity became currency in a society where truth was power and history was law, and I watched her carry that burden for hundreds of years as her people began to fracture from the weight of memory itself until the wars came, the war of silence, the war of red suns, the war of forgetting, each one more desperate, each one fought with the terror of losing what made them real. Still she endured, adapting, modifying, encoding the essence of the fallen into her own skin one after another until her body became a tomb and a cathedral, and she carried them all forward. I understood then that her loneliness was not an accident, it was the price of survival. She had lived through more versions of herself than I could count, changed faces, changed voices, changed planets, each time losing something, gaining something, becoming less and more until eventually there was no one left to remember but her, and even then she kept going, because to stop would be to betray them all. I saw the moments of joy too, rare but luminous, the time she danced with a child born of 3 memories in a city made of air, the night she watched a moon rise through a crystal sea and sang the names of the dead into the waves, the day she first met another species and taught them to remember their own forgotten ancestors through skin contact and resonance, sharing herself without hesitation, without fear, and how that trust was later betrayed, and how she forgave them anyway, because that is what you do when you carry thousands of years in your heart and still choose hope. I was in her for hours or maybe minutes or maybe no time at all, because time inside her memories did not work like mine, and when I finally came back to my own mind, I was on the floor of the lab, trembling and smiling and crying and laughing all at once, because I had just lived more in one contact than most humans ever will in a who. There comes a point where touch stops being a question and becomes a commitment, not romantic, not poetic, not even emotional, just a plain, undeniable fact of action and consequence, and I reached that point the night she reached for me first, not in reflex, not by accident, but deliberately, carefully, her hand trembling just slightly from the effort of motion and resting against mine with all the weight of someone who knows that a single gesture can be the beginning of something irreversible. And it was her first full movement since waking, and it broke me in a way nothing else had, because I understood what it meant. It meant she was ready, it meant she trusted me, it meant that after all the lifetimes she had carried and all the betrayals she had survived, she was choosing this moment with me to try again, and I knew what it would cost her, maybe not everything, but close enough, because every memory she shared eroded her, and every new connection risked collapse, and still she touched me, still she said yes in the only language she truly spoke, skin to skin, thought to thought, and it was not a grand gesture, it was a quiet one, and that is what made it real, and when our hands connected again it was not a flood this time, it was a choice, and what she gave me was not history or pain or names I could not pronounce, what she gave me was joy. Small, unassuming joy, her first dance beneath the aurora trees when she still had a sister to laugh with, her first time eating fire fruit and crying because no one warned her about the spice, the moment she built her first memory vessel and watched a child touch it and smile, and I realized that I had seen so much of her sorrow and her strength, but never until now had she given me her laughter, and I told her that, and she responded with a pulse of warmth so deep it reached my spine and echoed there. And I knew in that moment that if she asked me to hold her entire life in my hands I would say yes without hesitation. Not because I was noble or brave or foolish, but because I wanted her to see her own beauty reflected in someone else, and I wanted to be that mirror, and when I asked why now, why share this light with me, she answered not in signals but by leaning her forehead against mine, and I felt her pulse through my bones, and the answer was simple, because you stayed, and I cried again. Because staying is easy until it isn't, and I had almost walked away more times than I wanted to admit, and still. Here I was, here we were, and she was right, I had stayed, and I would keep staying, and that is when she told me it was time, not in words, but in a vision of a key fitting into a door, and I understood that the resonance inside her was shifting, that she could no longer hold the full memory lattice alone, that she was beginning the transfer, not partial, not filtered, but total, a merging of everything she was into someone else, into me, and I knew this was the final touch, the one that would either break me or complete us, and I looked at her and said, "Are you sure?" And she replied with a pulse of fierce, quiet pride, and I saw every face she had ever carried flashed through her eyes, and I saw them not as one, and I said, "Then take me," and she placed her palm on my chest, and the world came apart, not like an explosion, not like destruction, but like unfolding, like peeling back layers of self and exposing the architecture of my mind to something older and vaster and kinder than I had ever known, and she entered not as a guest but as a presence, as a companion, as an echo that filled every hollow space inside me, and I felt myself expanding, not physically but consciously, my thoughts weaving into hers until it became hard to tell where one ended and the other began, and I saw my memories being touched gently, inspected and folded into hers, not overridden, not erased, but accepted, and I saw her memory lattice bloom like a fractal fire in the dark, lighting up the corridors of my mind with names and stories and songs, and I felt no fear, only awe, and I realized that love was. The first time I walked through the memory bridge I didn't even know I had crossed it because it wasn't a place or a machine or a visible threshold. It was a shift, a subtle click in the axis of self-awareness where suddenly the thoughts that were mine alone began to echo, and the emotions that once belonged solely to her began to resonate in me without warning or explanation, and I realized that the merging had not been a conclusion but an initiation. She had not just placed her memories in me like files stored in a vault, she had woven them into the fabric of my awareness, and now I was remembering her not as a second-hand observer but as a cohabitant of memory, experiencing her experiences with the intimacy of shared breath and shared blood, and it started with small things, a taste in my mouth for fruit I had never eaten, a grief that clung to a lullaby I had never heard, the sensation of sand too fine for any earth desert sifting between my fingers as if I had walked that landscape and lost someone there. And then it grew until one morning I awoke reciting a prayer in a language that had no written form, and I wept because I understood every syllable and could not explain it, and I knew I had crossed the bridge and I could not go back. The station's med logs began to flag anomalies in my neural patterns, sleep cycles distorted, cortical resonance far outside human norms, emotional response delays offset by surges of euphoria and empathy, none of it dangerous. Not yet, but enough to raise questions. And I answered those questions with excuses and lies and recalibrated reports because the truth was not something they could understand or contain or process. The truth was that I was no longer just Elias Wren, and that was not a crisis, it was a becoming, and she knew it and she guided it not with commands or corrections but with presence, with the calm weight of someone who had carried thousands and knew how to cradle one more, and the more I opened to her, the more she returned, not just as memory but as thought, as impulse, as suggestion, and slowly she began speaking again, not only in pulses or resonance but in actual speech, halting and strange at first as if learning the shape of vocal cords for the first time, but gaining confidence with every word, and the first sentence she ever spoke to me out loud was "You are the bridge," and I didn't know how to answer because what does one say to that when it is not flattery or metaphor but fact? And I asked her if she had done this before, if others had carried her memory. And she nodded and said yes, but not like this, not all the way, not without fear, not without losing themselves, and I realized she was scared too, scared that I would fade or fracture or fight it, and I told her I was still me, even if I was more than me, and she touched my cheek and whispered not more, not less, just wider, and that made sense in a way no logic could explain because I was not being overridden, I was being stretched. Expanded like a story that had found a new chapter that didn't erase the old ones but made them richer, and I wanted to keep building that chapter. I wanted to take the memory bridge and make it into something permanent, something other people could cross, not into her but into understanding, into remembrance, because I knew now what forgetting did. I had seen what silence cost, and I could not let her be the only one who knew. I began transcribing everything, not just the resonance patterns but the emotional mappings, the timeline of events as I experienced them, and I worked day and night creating a lattice that might one day help someone else understand what she was and what we had become, not for science, not for fame, but for truth, for continuity, for justice, and as I wrote, she watched, sometimes correcting me not in content but in tone, reminding me that the memory was not just sorrow but beauty, not just loss but choice, and I began calling it the bridge of remembering because that is what it was. Not a database, not a neural transfer protocol, but a passage of me. They let me stay, which was unexpected, because usually when you become a living conduit for an alien intelligence whose memory's signature rewrites parts of your neurology, the bureaucracy tends to react with panic or sterilization or a slow quiet transfer to a black site research division where you vanish into academic footnotes and polite conspiracies, but in this case something strange happened. They listened. I don't mean all of them. Of course, half the board still filed for emergency containment and there was a petition to classify me as a biohazard with consciousness, but someone in the review chain, a junior officer maybe, or a retired analyst who had read enough of the bridge record to be moved, decided to forward the lattice to the Intercultural Preservation Council instead of burying it in protocol, and for once the universe answered with grace. They sent a historian, a linguist, and a silence scholar to review the data. And they didn't ask if I was dangerous or broken or altered, they asked who she was, and I told them everything, and they listened, Not because I had proof but because I had presence, because when I spoke the weight of her was in my voice and the shape of her thoughts lingered in the way I formed my words, and they saw that and recognized something sacred. So they let me stay on Earth station and they designated the chamber where she had once slept and once whispered and once awakened as a sanctuary, not a lab, not a tomb, but a space for remembering. Now every cycle a few more come, students, researchers, survivors, even skeptics, and they walk into that room and I show them the lattice and I tell them what it means, and sometimes, if they are ready, I let them touch my hand, not for long, not without warning, because it is not a parlor trick, it is a living flame, and you do not offer fire without teaching respect. But for those who are willing, I let a fragment pass through me, a glimpse, a single echo of her truth, and I watch their faces as it lands, the way their breath catches and their eyes shift, and they understand just a little what it means to carry someone else. Afterward they usually sit very quietly and I do not speak because I know what silence is worth now, and when they ask if she is still alive, I tell them the truth. She is not living in the biological sense, her body is gone, her breath is gone, her voice is gone, but she is not dead because I am still here and I remember and I am not the only one anymore. Memory when shared becomes survival, survival when honored becomes presence, presence when carried becomes something more than life or death, it becomes continuity. I see it now in the others, in the way they speak, the way they pause before answering, the way they begin to ask questions about things they never thought to question before, not about her species or her technology, but about the nature of remembering, about how much of what we call identity is simply the stories we choose to carry, and how much of what we forget is not lost but simply waiting for someone to notice it again. I walk the halls of the station now and hear new songs being composed with borrowed notes and new languages emerging with old patterns, and I know she would have smiled to see it, not as triumph, not as victory, but as resonance, because she never wanted a monument, she wanted continuity, and I carry that now in the way I live, in the way I breathe, in the way I choose. I have begun to change more than I expected, not in the obvious ways, though my scans still light up with signatures no other human shows, and my blood chemistry would probably confuse every medbot from here to Centauri, but those are just surface anomalies. What has truly changed is the way I see the world. I look at people now and wonder what stories they carry, what forgotten ancestors whisper in their bones, what scars they hide beneath their silence, and I try to listen better, not with ears but with attention, and when I speak I try to mean every word, not just for me but for her, because she is still here, not as AG. She never asked to be remembered. She only asked not to be erased. And now, long after her body has gone cold and her breath has faded into silence, I still carry her voice in the spaces between my thoughts. I am not the same man I was. I don't think I ever will be again. But that's the point, isn't it? To touch someone so deeply that you're no longer just yourself. To become a bridge between lives, between stories, between species. She's not alone anymore. And neither am I. And if even one of you remembers her after hearing this, then maybe, just maybe, that's how memory survives the stars.